I like to think of globalization as sort of this idea of global stratification, and you and us and me. I am part of this world, and I am somehow affected by global stratification. As living in a wealthy country, we sort of benefit from some aspects of global stratification, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, which is extreme poverty. And I don't want to dwell on this too much because I don't think I need to hammer home the idea that extreme poverty is bad. But it is. It is out there. It exists, and it's bad. People live in real tough situations. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as people living on less than $1.90 a day. And some of the hallmarks, we're talking about lack of adequate food, shelter, clean water, education, security, right? There's a lack of institutions, right? And we talked about how important institutions are. So there's a lack of effective police, a lack of effective governance, a lack of effective sanitation, infrastructure. Those things are just lacking in these extremely poor places. And the book does a good job of driving home the idea that women and children are most negatively affected by extreme poverty. I don't need to dwell on that anymore. It's written in the book pretty clearly. Race is also a factor, but it's a little more nuanced. But we'll actually get into that more when we get into our race chapter and sort of the origin of our concept of race. But if you do a Google search for extreme poverty and you see faces, you're gonna have a tough time finding white faces, and that's a fact that you can't really get around. And as a sociologist, I would be doing a disservice if we didn't address that. Unfortunately, we're not going to address it here, but we'll address it more when we get into the race chapter. All right. So the old number was $1.25 a day. Then again, that comes from the World Bank, and we'll talk about the World Bank more in just a second. But they changed the threshold in 2011. So in the second video that's going to be posted from Crash Course Economics, they're still using that $1.25 a day figure, which I don't know why, because the video was made after 2011. But regardless, the World Bank, for whatever reason, changed the threshold in 2011, and that's the first time the global population living in extreme poverty. That's a misprint. Whoops. The global population living in extreme poverty dropped below 1 billion for the first time in 2011 when the World Bank sort of moved the goalpost. We got to talk about the nation state, the idea of the nation state that came from the Treaty of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War in Europe in 1648. So everything that we're talking about now, we're talking about how countries are categorized. And so this is where we have the modern idea, what we think of as a country. This had to be forged, right? We weren't, humanity wasn't born into the earth with the idea of countries being a thing, right? That idea had to be forged and formed over a long period of time, and it was really crystallized in Europe in 1648 in a treaty that ended the 30 Years' War. The actual causes of the 30 Years' War are super convoluted and weird. And it has a lot to do with that if you remember, if you've taken the Middle Ages, a history of the Middle Ages kind of class, you had the fiefdoms and serfs and knights and kingdoms, and it's just all sorts of independent little tiny kingdoms everywhere that ended up going to war with each other all the time. And in order to curb that a little bit, the European entities that came to the table decided they would form themselves into countries, and the idea was you would respect each other's national sovereignty, right? That each country that they drew had the right to make its own decisions and govern itself as it sees fit. So we're still sort of in this Westphalian era. They call it the Westphalian era in political science. We are still in that Westphalian era of the nation state, where the whole country or the whole world is divided up into countries, and we think of governance in those terms. Again, that's sort of a weird bit of trivia, the Treaty of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War, but it's just important to know that this idea of the nation state of the country didn't come from nowhere. We had to negotiate it and agree on it. So we're going to talk about theories of globalization, but first I'm going to take a little pause. All right, so our theories behind global stratification or globalization that the book talked about, we got modernization theory, and we've already talked about this a little bit. We talked about it in our chapter on culture, the idea that we're in the process of development. We think of global stratification and globalization in different places that countries are in, and sort of a linear model, right? It's all on a line moving towards this last stage of high mass consumption, which is where the Western world, where the United States and Europe currently is. And I don't want you to worry about the stages so much as this, the modernization theory is this idea of development. So the book talked about the nomenclature, the terms that we use to describe the different places the different countries are in. And we had first world, second world, third world. That fell out of favor. And we went into the idea of the developed world and the underdeveloped world and the developing world. And that terminology, that nomenclature comes from modernization theory, right? Is that everybody is somewhere on this path to development, to being developed. And the hallmark of being developed is this idea of high mass consumption. And the next video, the second video that we're going to watch for this week, delves into the environmental issues that getting everybody in the world to this fifth stage of high mass consumption that could create some environmental problems, right? In the second video, we'll talk about that. But for our purposes, think of modernization theory, again, as this linear model of development, that everybody is eventually going to move to being just like us. Which, again, we talked about this in the culture chapter, maybe a bit of an ethnocentric view, that everybody wants to one day end up looking just like the United States or France or something. The other side of that is dependency theory, and it's a pretty simple concept, even though the hows and the whys of it get a little more tricky. But as a basic concept, it's the idea that rich nations get fat by exploiting the poor nations, right? And this cartoon does a great job of sort of giving you a visualization of the concept. So again, the hows and the whys get a little more complicated, but the basic principle is that rich nations got rich by exploiting the resources of the poorer nations. So we can't really talk about globalization without talking about the history of it and how we got to the current era, and that is through colonialism, right? Colonialism was the original globalization or sort of imperialism. If you remember from your history books, the age of imperialism, when European countries were setting up colonies all over the place. This was through the 1600s and the 1700s. And it kind of follows that Treaty of Westphalia, where, and it's a little bit ironic, right? Because the countries in Europe all agreed to respect each other's sovereignty. And then they went out and to expand their countries elsewhere, right? They went to the Americas, they went to Africa, and they went to South Asia to set up to expand their empires that way. Instead of trying to take over their land from their neighbors, they just went out. They just went further out into the world to set up new lands. Anyway, that was the idea of colonialism, right? You're spreading out and you're sort of subjugating or dominating the people who are already living there for economic gain. The idea is you're extracting resources, that's natural resources and labor, and it goes from colonized to colonizer. So that's just an important distinction to make there. So this next part is going to be a visual representation. We're going to see how the European colonial empires sort of changed over time. Hang on, I meant to get rid of my computer sound there. Let me get rid of that. There it goes. All right, so it starts off, we've got your European nations, and you can sort of see where they're expanding their foothold into other places, starting with the Americas mostly, right? And there, by 1754, you got colonies all over most of South America into North America. The Spanish are big time, right? That's why everybody in South America and Central America speaks Spanish. But then as something interesting happens here, you had the wars of independence, right? You had the American Revolution, and then in the early 1800s, you had Simón Bolivar, who basically organized armies all over South America to sort of expel the Spanish. And then, of course, the American Revolution expelled the English and set up independent governance in the Americas. But again, it's important to note that this wasn't sort of this wasn't a war of independence for the people who had been living here before, right? The indigenous populations of the Americas still remain sort of a subjugated class long after their respective wars of independence. Just a little note there. But then as the 19th century wears on, finally, this is where we get into Africa. Oh, yeah. This was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Basically, all of Africa became one form or another of a colony of Europe, right? Blue is France. This purplish color is Great Britain. And so Great Britain obviously had colonies everywhere: Australia, Canada, India. There's over here, there's Bangladesh, and there's Vietnam, all the South Asian countries. They were former British colonies. So they remained colonies up until after World War II. Now, after World War II ended in 1945, remember? And after World War II, we got into the era of decolonization, where we decided that, respecting national sovereignty also meant you had to respect the national sovereignty of countries in Africa, South America, and South Asia. So the decolonization was a process, and the idea was that you were shifting national sovereignty to the people that lived in those countries, that you were getting rid of your colonies. And that took a while, but by our modern era, the whole globe had basically been decolonized. Basically. Now, I show you this map to try to give you an idea of the legacy of colonialism in in the world today. When you look at the places that were most heavily colonized, were colonized the latest, right? And these are the places that are still colonized through the first half of the 20th century. There's a real high correlation between that and where the current nations are the most poor, right? You go back here. Oh no, I lost the map. But you can see that where the colonies lasted the longest and were the places that were colonized most recently are still the poorest places in the world today. So there's sort of an undeniable link between being a former colony more recently and today being one of the poorest countries in the world. So let me take a pause again. So World War II ends, and all the countries, all the victors of World War II get together, and they decide that they're going to begin this era of decolonization. They're going to start giving up their colonies, and they're going to sort of replace that with a new model of globalization. The old model of globalization, of colonialism, was rightly deemed sort of inhumane, and it was. So they're coming up with a new era of globalization, and this is really important that this comes in the context of the Cold War, because as soon as World War II ends, we're setting up sort of an ideological war between capitalism and communism. And so the capitalist countries who are the victors of World War II, they get together to talk about how they're going to create an international capitalist system that is going to sort of maintain some sort of order and allow a continuation of the model that had that had fostered international trade and allowed the modern era to really take hold. So they came up with the Bretton Woods Conference. It was 1944. It was in New Hampshire. This was right before World War II ended, but the writing was on the wall who was going to win and how the Cold War lines were going to be drawn. But the Bretton Woods Conference established three key organizations: the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which eventually became the World Trade Organization. That's not that important. I don't want you to worry about the details of that, but just know that the victors of World War II, the capitalist victors of World War II, so the Western European nations and the United States got together, and they formed these organizations to help facilitate international currency cooperation, international economic cooperation, and trade agreements. And also, the World Bank's main idea was to get everybody to sort of end global or extreme poverty and get all these other countries, these former colonies, get them up to our level of development. So these institutions are all heavily influenced by this modernization theory, right? They're trying to help get the developing world to become developed, right? Getting them to that era of high mass consumption. Now, dependency theories and I put dependency theories, and there are different variations and different derivatives of dependency theory. The key one, I think, is world systems theory. I'm not gonna make you learn that, but just know that dependency theory isn't an end-all be-all. There are a lot of sort of derivatives of dependency theory and a lot of developed and evolutions of dependency theory from there. But dependency theorists, in general, came to think of these Bretton Woods organizations and sort of this effort to globalize capitalism as a thing that ended up largely hurting the working class, right? Or as a form of neo-colonialism, right? But instead of countries being the colonizers, multinational corporations became the colonizers, right? And the idea is that it creates this race to the bottom. So what makes a country most attractive for most multinational investment is bad for the little people, right? So in order to get, and you see this now, right? And this was forged by organizations like the IMF and the World Trade Organization. But the idea is that the worse conditions you have for your workers, the more profitable it is for a company to set up a factory in your country. So in order to attract international investment, countries wanted to lower their wages, abolish minimum wages. They wanted to get rid of regulations regarding workplace safety. They needed to get rid of any protections to their workers that would make things more expensive, environmental regulations, anything that would make it more expensive for a company to set up a factory or some sort of plant in your country, you had to get rid of. And so by bringing everybody into this sort of developmentalist view, right, the modernization view that everybody needs to get to this era of high mass consumption, the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund encouraged countries, and sometimes we won't get into it too much, but sometimes maybe even coerced countries along the global South and South America, Africa, and South Asia, encourage these countries to deregulate and to get rid of any sort of governmental barrier that would block these multinational companies from being able to set up cheap manufacturing plants. Anyway, that's where we got. So the race to the bottom is the idea of lowering your working standards, right? The standards of living for your workers in your country so much that it makes it super cheap for a multinational corporation to set up a manufacturing plant in your country. And that is going to be your path to development, right? International investment from these MNCs, from these multinational corporations, is what is going to get you to stage 5 on the modernization theory. And that's where we're at. So that's the sort of modern era of globalization, is the era of the multinational corporation. And our next video is going to talk a little bit more about that. And our discussion board this week has also to do with that sort of global supply chain that that was set up through these Bretton Woods organizations. And again, I'm not going to quiz you on or test you on the Bretton Woods organizations and how that all happened. I just wanted to go over that with you and let you know that this was sort of forked, right? Just like the idea of countries didn't just come out of nowhere. It had to be born. It came from somewhere, and it was done very purposefully. So was the idea that we have now global supply chains, and so that the T-shirt that you're wearing is made up of cotton from Texas, and then was spun in a factory in China to make it into yarn, and then it was woven together at a garment shop in Bangladesh, and then it was packaged and sold in the United States. And then when you are done with it and you throw it out and you give it to a thrift store, it's going to end up going to Africa or to another one of these poorer countries. I don't know if you know that, but clothing that goes to thrift stores and don't get sold, they end up being donated. So if you go to a big slum in Kenya, you'll see people walking around in like UNC Tar Heel shirts. They don't know what that means. It's just where the shirts ended up. So anyway, yeah, the next video is going to talk about the sort of economics behind globalization and how it's sort of how the current era of globalization has some good and bad effects, and then also the extra credit, the Bananaland documentary also shows you some of that sort of darker side of how global enterprises were forged. Excuse me. All right, that's all I got. I'm cutting it off there. Thanks for sticking with me.